You would bring it back to work. Probably better start.
Yeah, and people can actually watch live.
If you hadn't been able, you would have been okay.
Well, because we would have started. Okay, so it turns out that
We're learning that.
yeah, we're learning about it. I just want to, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you this one.
All right, it's noon, so we had a little time for networking, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Good as the speaker for the great turnout today. This morning I was actually in the HMEB, the Herald Medical Education Building, the nice building. Thank you, Dr. Good, for getting back to us. It's going to be one of your founding legacies. And he's going to be talking about that today. Way back, Dr. Good and I and Jeff Bernstein in the 80s, late 80s, we started on what he would talk about the human patient simulator. So for the August lecture, I will talk further about the SPS. But today, the title of the lecture is on HP planning for an unknown future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sim. Appreciate it. Sim mentioned our friendship and professional relationship go back now, I think, 30 plus years, and center around the human patient simulator. And I think the timing is great because hopefully everybody knows on Wednesday at 4:30 in the afternoon we're going to dedicate the new Herald Medical Education Building sits between across from the Academic Research Building and the McKnight Brain Institute. I'm sure you've seen the construction. But I thought it would be interesting to both look at the work that's been done in simulation and then to share with you some of the exciting facilities we're going to have available in the new Herald Medical Education Building. So really kind of a great week to think about the future of the College of Medicine. I was trying to think of how to frame this, and probably going to get, this isn't exactly a scholarly quote here, but those of you that probably remember Rumsfeld when he was Secretary of Defense shortly after 9/11 had this great quote that he subsequently got beat up over and over and over again because he said, reports that say there's something that hasn't happened are always interesting to me because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. And we also know there are known unknowns. So that is to say, we know there are some things that we do not know. But there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know what we don't know. And if we look throughout history, the history of our country and other free countries, it is this category, the unknown unknowns, that tend to be the difficult ones. So again, you can read a lot about the quote and what happened, the discussion afterwards. It was all actually kind of interesting. But I think that framework of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns actually can be helpful to us as we think about both simulation and simulation experiential learning, its role in medical education, and particularly as it relates to today, to our new Herald Medical Education building. July is also a fitting time to be talking about patient simulation, because clearly one role for experiential learning is helping those, if you will, those that are entering residency, entering medical school, whatever learner group you're responsible for. There's a set of, for lack of a better word, what we'll call basic skills, the known knowns, the things that new learners, for example, in an anesthesiology department, my department, need to learn. So all types of airway management, clinical skills, assessing pulses and breath sounds, learning how to both provide mask ventilation or endotracheal intubation, are all the kind of so-called basic skills that a new anesthesiology resident in that context need to learn. And so throughout actually decades, many individuals have tried or worked to develop optimal experiential learning experiences for beginners. On the top panel is Abramson and Denson, who actually in the late 60s had an early patient simulator. They were challenged because the computer that was required to run that simulator was so big it had to be located in the engineering campus, and they had all kinds of trouble getting the learners to the engineering campus. But on the right panel you see that, like many, they showed that the beginners could acquire a set of defined skills with fewer trials and shorter periods of time than those that didn't have the simulator-based learning. And similarly, many years later, in the late 80s and early 90s, the lower panel is a picture from our residency and some of our early work, where we showed that in the early weeks of residency, those that were exposed to simulator-based education acquired, or as based on the evaluation of their professors, they were acquiring skills at a greater rate than a group that had equivalent time, but in a lecture format. And of course, these were basic skills, and by 13, 14 weeks, the two groups had reached about the same level of proficiency. But this notion of the known knowns, the things that we know our learners need to learn, learning it in the actual clinical environments has one whole set of challenges, and certainly many people think that simulator-based or experiential learning-based education offers advantages. It's hard to imagine, and this is where I realize I'm getting old, but we actually, during my career in anesthesia, lived through starting with open cholecystectomy, and nowadays what is probably quite a rare operation, an open cholecystectomy. The laparoscopic procedures were all emerging in the late 80s and early 90s. And again, I show this just as an example of what we consider basic skills is constantly changing on us. So our simulator our tools and our curricula also need to be constantly changing. So for example, a new type of surgery was emerging in the late 80s and early 90s. And if you look at the performance of a large group of surgeons, a large number of procedures, and you look at the complications, 90% of the bile duct injuries occurred in the first 30 cases. So the thought was, what if we could get that learning curve traversed, get those early errors out of the way using experiential learning rather than patients. Other factors such as the age of the physician, the size of the surgical group, academic versus private practice, all those things didn't matter. It was the number of repetitions, if you will, and in this case, a pretty achievable number somewhere in the 30 to 50 range. And so a whole new set of experiential learning devices or technologies, if you will, emerged to help address that need. And all surgical simulation centers that have surgeons as learners have these types of devices and their successors. So certainly we can use experiential learning to help particularly beginners learn the known knowns, if you will, learn the psychomotor and cognitive skills necessary to practice in a particular discipline or specialty. But this is, and I didn't want to show too many old photographs, but on the left, that's me, Sam Gordon Gibby, and J.S. Gravenstein with one of our earlier simulators. They were really, in many ways, works of art. People criticize that photograph because, of course, we're staring at the anesthesia machine, not at the patient. The patient in the early days, we were working for, developing tools for anesthesiologists. So, of course, the head and our side of the ether screen, if you will, were most important. Kind of backfired one time. We were at a meeting with the upper right panel with just the head, and a couple came by, and the husband turned to the wife and said, "See, I told you I'm glad I didn't go to Gainesville that surgery. That guy did, and he came back half a man." So we worked hard to fill out the rest of the mannequin in ensuing years. One of the reasons we are staring at the equipment here is Sem and his team did some really clever things with a whole variety of very rare complications that can challenge an anesthesiologist. Perhaps one of the rarest is where, for a variety of reasons, the nitrous oxide can get crossed with the oxygen, and obviously that's one of the most difficult sometimes to assess problems that an anesthesiologist can encounter, but it's exceptionally rare. Probably about once a year in the world do we have some type of a pipeline cross. And so the ability to take these rare things, something extremely rare like that, but a whole list of other problems that I show on the right that are certainly not the everyday encounter an anesthesiologist is not going to encounter every day, but most likely will encounter during their career. Again, I talked today about probably 20 years worth of work, large teams of individuals were responsible over the years. We've been in many places, including, this is where the 1329 building sits. At one time when there was a house there, and that became our laboratory. I told you we had to fill out the simulator, fill out the body part of the simulator, so there were always body parts all over the laboratory, if you will, sometimes not in correct anatomical correlations. This is a unique configuration of the simulation center. Does anybody know what the lower left panel, what simulation configuration that is? No? That's the philanthropic or donor configuration of the simulator. And I just use that to point out, obviously, for much of our work, our donors and friends are an important part. And again, fitting as we enter the medical education building this week, it's a $46 million building, and it was put together at a time where there were no state funds for building. So that building has $31 million of gifts from donors and friends and alumni, and about a $15 million mortgage. But anyway, the philanthropic configuration of the building is important. And you'll see the plaques and tributes to various donors when you're in the building. And if you know any of them or see them, please thank them. They've given us a really important gift. So going back to the kind of the known unknowns, this is kind of the hypothetical. If you assume that an anesthesiologist, if you assume that some of these critical incidents in anesthesia occurs, pick a number, once every 5,000 anesthetics, trainees will do about 2,000 supervised anesthetics during their training, but they'll do, depending on their career and the type of practice they enter, they'll do 20 to 30,000 anesthetics during a career. So you don't need advanced math degrees to see that you're probably not going to encounter the majority of these rare events during your training, but you most likely will see them once or twice or 3 times during your career. So this is where experiential learning becomes particularly important. And just to take the hypothetical to the actual, these are some various representative studies in the literature where individuals have tried to quantitate some of these rare or less common challenges. While unexpected difficult intubation is probably 1 to 3%, a failed intubation, a failed scenario where the anesthesiologist is unable to secure the airway, 0.05 to 0.35%. Malignant hyperthermia, about 1 in 100,000 surgeries in adults, 1 in 30,000 in children. Or anaphylaxis, somewhere estimated to be between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 20,000. So that first slide, which had kind of the theoretical construct, does seem to relate with the reported incidence of some of these challenges that are reported in the literature. And the reason that experiential learning or simulator-based training is so important is some of these rare or less common complications require some pretty invasive interventions, whether transtracheal or cricothyroidotomy type access to the airway, needles to the chest to relieve tension pneumothorax, or pericardial aspiration of pericardial tamponade. And so again, you can imagine trying to learn these the first time when they're rare to start with. And so these are the types of things that have been, simulation has been extremely helpful into letting us get comfortable in learning not only to diagnose the problem, but to treat it. And so does all of this matter? Again, like many things in the educational space, we have both anecdote and some statistics. In the early 2000s, Mike Olympio, an anesthesiologist, began collecting reports of individuals who said, you know what, in many cases, I just saved somebody's life, or I just got through a situation that I'm not sure I would have gotten through had it not been for the test drive in the simulator. And in the newsletter of the American Society of Anesthesiologists, he began to report some of these stories that people relate to him. And again, I showed you the tension pneumothorax in a trauma patient, and the individual who took care of the patient reported, as I stabbed the left chest tube into her left chest, I thought I was puncturing a car tire as a large hissing sound erupted from her chest. Instantly, the arterial waveform leaped from nothing to everything, and the capnograph jumped back to life. And if you've worked through tension pneumothorax in the simulation environment, you know it's just, particularly if you've encountered it in the real environment, you know the stress levels that differ between perhaps encountering it in actual patient care and not feeling prepared versus having been through something 2 or 3 or 4 times in the simulator. And other examples of more aggressive or more invasive type, particularly airway rescues. Obviously, that's a big challenge for anesthesiologists. So we have both anecdotal evidence that simulation matters, and then hopefully those interested in simulation have seen Cook's paper from JAMA in 2011, a pretty inclusive meta-analysis. They used a variety of search techniques to identify almost 11,000 articles related on his term technology-enhanced simulation, identifying over 600 studies that involved 35,000 trainees. The studies included randomized trials, non-randomized trials, and a number of pre-test, post-test type designs. And you can work through the paper on yourself. Again, it's a very inclusive and well-done meta-analysis. And it showed that when technology-enhanced simulation education was compared with no intervention, the technology-enhanced simulation was consistently associated with large effects in outcomes of knowledge, skill, and behaviors, and moderate effects for patient-related outcomes. So they did show patient-related outcomes improved with those who have been through experiential learning, simulator-based technology. And so, as over time, the evidence gathers both in the collection of anecdotal reports as well as statistics and studies such as these. I mentioned a couple times already this notion of learning curves. This is a slide that I had in the deck for a long time, the so-called retention benefits of spaced rehearsal. Again, it's very fitting to be doing all this in July because as shown conceptually here, our level of recall of a particular knowledge or skill, if we learn it once and then have to recall it later, there's a decay in our ability to recall something that we've learned once. But the so-called benefits of spaced rehearsal is each time we have kind of a refresher, not only does it pull our recollection or our ability to recall higher, but we plateau at higher and higher levels and have a greater ability to recall the knowledge or perform the skill that we've learned with repeated or spaced rehearsal. So what did we just all get done doing in July? Whether it's a new student or we're about to do it to the students in 2 days, we've all probably done it to our residents, maybe to our graduate students. Orientation. We give them 8 to 16 hours of sit in the room and absorb. And this would suggest we probably, instead of having one 8-hour session, we probably should have had 8 one-hour sessions with so-called spaced rehearsal or spaced educational experiences. I've become fascinated. Not only do I think at UF here we have a great work that's being done in the education space with simulators and experiential learning, but we also have an exceptionally strong neuroscience department and neuroscience experts here. I saw a couple years ago David Nichols is an anesthesiologist at Hopkins, and in a tribute to Ed Miller, who was retiring after a 15-year run as the dean and CEO of Johns Hopkins Medical Center, talked about a number of effects that his title was Why Learning Sticks, but the first one that he talked about there was this spacing effect. And it actually turns out, and this is where I'm going to get in real trouble, but it is a little bit provocative, because we think about our curricula and we think about the exercises that we put our learners through, but actually to get it to stick, there's a whole bunch of neurochemistry basically that has to happen, and I won't pretend to even understand all of this, but the fact is, and this is one of several review papers, there are biochemical and molecular determinants of why spaced learning is superior to, they call it mass training. So in other words, long-term memory formation is sensitive to the patterns of the training sessions. And training sessions distributed over time, so-called spaced training, is superior at long-term memory, generating long-term memories, than when there is little or no interval, so-called mass training, what we just did with all of our orientation periods. And again, they go into the paper reviewing the current thoughts on the very specific, cyclic AMP mediated, the transcription factors, all of the biochemistry that we often don't think about, but to record memory, to get something to store in our central nervous system. At the end of the day, some pretty sophisticated biochemistry has to happen. And so this is why experiential learning makes sense, and particularly experiential learning that spread over time. The second aspect that Nichols talked about was the vividness effect, or this whole notion of what's the right role of stress. As Sam and I, Tammy's been doing this a long time, as we've watched various simulator groups, there's a lot of opinion about whether there's, should the simulation environment encounter stress, should it be a stressful environment or should it be a non-stressful environment, and so on. And it's interesting because, again, another very nice review paper begins to help explain current theory about why there is actually enhanced learning, but there's a big if. If learning and stress occur together, and particularly if the stress is context specific, it turns out both our adrenergic system and our glucocorticoid system work to help enhance the encoding, the consolidation, and the storage of information in our central nervous system. And so, particularly in context-specific stress, that actually can be helpful in helping to encode the information and the knowledge base that we're trying to transfer or to have the learner acquire in our experiential learning exercises. Interestingly, stress that is spaced or separated from learning exercise or the learning event, and particularly if it's not context related, as it usually is when it's separated, actually one of the things the glucocorticoids do is they suppress unrelated information or processing. And so if you're stressed about issue A and trying to learn subject B, particularly the glucocorticoids have a suppression effect of information that's not related to the stressor. And so the notion of how many times have people said, yeah, we'll go to the simulation center on your day off after call. So you're up all night, you're stressed, you're tired, you may be stressed from your experiences of being on call, and so then we say go to the simulator and learn. Probably not the best approach. So spacing has a biochemical or a molecular basis for helping us, and we need to think about the right levels of stress to incorporate into our exercises. Those of you that to the AAMC meeting in November, we heard a fascinating talk by Alda, and among other things, he talked about an African tribe that would identify the most advanced 7-year-old who was destined to become the chief. They would take the 7-year-old and begin to impart all the knowledge and the history of the tribe that they needed to make sure this future chief remembered. So you'd have a day-long session with the elders of the tribe, trying to get the 7-year-old to absorb as much information as they could. And then they take the child out to the river, knowing the child could not swim, throw him in the river, let him almost drown, and just before he finally went under for the last time, they'd pull him out and resuscitate him to make sure the child never forgot that day. Now, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but think about, so many of you, what were you doing the day John F. Kennedy was killed? Or what were you doing the day 9/11? I was actually talking to one of our building donors, and she vividly recalled as a 6-year-old they were hiding some folks in Europe during World War II in their house. She remembers the soldiers coming down the street, and she was absolutely sure that her family was going to get caught. She doesn't remember what day happened the day before, doesn't remember what happened the day after, but all of us have these vivid recollections of some very specific days. And if you go back and think about it, there was some type of stress associated with that moment in time. So while Alda's description made it easy for me to remember how to convey this, I think there is something to be said for us thinking about some of these neurochemical, biochemical, molecular processes that are involved in how we encode, and I think we can design our experiential learning taking into account spacing and vividness and stress in the right way to help enhance learning. So hopefully, again, I'm probably giving Rumsfeld too much credit, but hopefully we've gotten through the known knowns, the things everybody needs to practice to master, and the known unknowns, the so-called rare things that is helpful if we can have some spaced rehearsal. But what about the unknown unknowns? And so in a minute I'm going to start transitioning to our new medical education building. I want to remind everybody it started, I give Joe Fantone a lot of credit when he got here with many of your help, did a head-to-toe kind of assessment of our medical schools education, the curricula that we help our students learn by. And just even though the medical school is going to be 60 years old next year, really this was just the fourth major overhaul, if you will, or modernization of the curriculum. And you can see the key themes that permeate the new curriculum, most importantly being patient-centered, but a tremendous amount of active collaboration, team-based learning, and a lot of experiential learning and assessment. Elements had always been present in the medical school curriculum, but the goal was to significantly enhance them. The problem was, as most of you know, this medical school's been in the basement of this building, a 1972 facility, almost 40 years old, and really didn't allow this curriculum to be fully implemented until we got a new facility built. And so, as you'll hear over the next week and in the coming months, the Herald Medical Education Building we designed a medical education curriculum first, and then designed a facility second that would allow us to fully deliver that curriculum. And this building will open on Wednesday, and I can only touch a few of the highlights here, so I hope you'll be able to come out Wednesday afternoon and evening and really learn about the building firsthand. What I wanted to focus on in this talk is elements of the third and fourth floor, which include the Learning and Assessment Center and also the Experiential Learning Center and Theater. So on the third floor, amongst a whole bunch of 20-ish kind of small room, conference-style rooms, is the Learning and Assessment Center. And back here you'll see there's 18 rooms that look like examination rooms in a doctor's office or an outpatient clinic. It can be 18 outpatient rooms or 12 outpatient and 6. These all have head walls. They can be hospital type rooms. And then we have 2 hospital rooms that are designed full-scale replicas of the hospital rooms in UF Health Shands, in our various Shands facilities. Even things like how the nursing station, the configurations on most of our wards now, where a nurse will have visual access to the 2 patients that she or he are taking care of. So that's the learning learning skills and assessment center. And then on the 4th floor is the Experiential Learning Center and the Experiential Learning Theater, which I'm going to highlight. So you noticed I used the word theater. You say, well, why is the dean talking about theater when he's talking about the simulation center? And therein lies what we tried to figure out. Lou Obendorf, who licensed the UF technology and had a company for many years that sold it. One of his favorite quotes is the Gretzky Quote, "I like to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it's been." In most institutions, if you go to, when they build their simulation center, they build facilities that look like how we practice medicine today. They build an ICU, they build ORs, they build emergency departments, and that actually works very well. But I just told you we've been in our current medical school building for 40 years. So does anybody think about how are we going to practice medicine 40 years from now? And more importantly, how do we make sure this new facility that we're building, that we just put a lot of money into, can help us move forward in that unknown world? Hence the rest of the title, how do you plan for unknowable futures? And so, again, just to summarize here, how do we make sure we're relevant 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe even 30 years from now. I believe both. We're right at the nexus of healthcare, which is so dynamic, and higher education, which is so dynamic. And so we're in a very dynamic world. And so how can we make sure that our simulation and our experiential learning centers and facilities are relevant, even though the future, I believe, is unknowable. So these are some of the environments that we practice in today, you know, with the surgical robots, increasing, whether through warfare, terrorism, and so on, a lot more field work. These are some pictures from other simulation centers, and obviously those spaces are ones that look familiar today. I tried to look in the crystal ball. These are some of the things I'm seeing. This one actually is not so far out anymore, but think about, I don't know if any of you have tried on the Ebola suits, but they make particularly critical care a lot more challenging. I believe there's an evolving group of physicians that will actually do, they'll provide remote access. This is this ECHO project. We had Dr. Aurora from New Mexico, whereas experts at the university, they actually provide peer-to-peer consultation throughout the entire state of New Mexico. These EICU systems continue to emerge, and then even this hospital in the home. I mean, it's really trying to think ahead 30 to 40 years and make sure we have a simulation center that is relevant with something that we're trying to do. And so hence came this idea of a stage or a theater. What if instead of building physical things that look like ORs or ICUs or spaces that we practice medicine in today, what if we just started with a sound stage, an empty stage, and if we were practicing, if the learners were learning emergency department, emergency room, we'd put the emergency room set on the stage. But the next day, maybe it's the obstetrical lessons that are to be learned, and so we could create a space that looks, that is a full-scale replica of how learners need to, those in the learning about obstetrics need to learn. And so we started working with this notion of theater. We studied theaters in the kind of the onstage area, the control aspects, and also the backstage, and most importantly, storage. How many of you have been to a simulation center that has adequate storage? Right, nobody. So we tried to think through that. So the Experiential Learning Theater is a large open space in the middle of the 4th floor with both visual access, particularly for the controllers and the gawkers, quite frankly, on this side. And then careful thought onto how sets and props, if you will, are moved into the learning theater. And then similarly, careful planning of the circulation around the theater with both workshops and development activities in this hallway, the control rooms, the control central stations here, and then storage, and particularly high-density storage positioned around here. Conference rooms for both briefing and debriefing, which are important parts of experiential learning exercises. And so we start with this large space, kind of an aerial view. Here you see the control room. And what we did is we set this up so it can be one large space, or there's a large sky wall that can drop down and divide the space into two. An additional sky wall that can drop down and break it into three. Or then we start involving portable walls. We can break it down into 4 spaces. Or finally, I'll show you in a minute, additional walls and get to total of 8 spaces. A lot of thought went into the learning theater. That it's elevated so we can run electricity and gas and other and video or digital connections on the floor. Lots of LCDs, one for each of the potential 8 bays. The sky walls I've already mentioned. Then these mobile head walls, which I'll show you a close-up. One of the things I had not appreciated But as I think back, some of the simulation centers we visited, a lot of audio and video recording equipment, and of course then the surgeon or the learner would grab like a light or a boom, and there'd be interaction between the mechanical components and the AV. So there's actually two separate grids in the ceiling. One is the technical grid for the heavy equipment, and then a second grid for the cameras and the lights and particularly the microphones, so we don't cross-contaminate the mechanical noise on the AV. And so again, just a lot of thought into the theater. Here's this mobile head wall. You see the picture better here. So I'll show you in a minute. The gas drops come down. I believe does the electricity come from the ceiling or the floor? I can't remember. But anyway, these mobile head walls allow us to get further partitioning of the spaces. So here's artist renderings of what the large space would look like. Here you see the gas drops. And then you can drop the Skytron wall and have two still pretty decent, say, procedure rooms or operating rooms. Then here these portable head walls come in, and we start to get division this way. And now this is with, say, 8. You could have up to 8 stations set up, either in an open configuration or using the Skytron walls and the other portable wall. You could actually get 8 individual bays set up. So again, depending on the learner group and the exercises to be learned, this one day might be all OB, or it might be all operating room, or you could also envision a type of a MASH casualty, a field exercise. Or I'm kind of excited, I don't know if we'll be able to pull this off, but you could also do sequences. So in each of the 8 bays, you could have, for example, a trauma patient, and you could move them through each of the stations, including things like ambulance and so on. And then similarly, particularly in military or civilian terrorist or type situations, practice the whole sequence of care with each of the stations having a different configuration. And again, most importantly, making sure that as the places and the spaces that we deliver care to patients going forward, particularly the ones we can't imagine 20 years from now, that our experiential learning space remains relevant and adaptable to those unknown futures. So we're kind of excited about the theater. It's a novel approach that enables simulator-based experiential learning in the healthcare environments of today while maintaining maximal flexibility, the unknowable future of healthcare delivery, the healthcare delivery environments, facilities, and systems of care going forward. So in summary, the patient simulation and experiential learning are now widely accepted learning methods in the training and continuing education of all kinds of healthcare professionals. Again, something we hope to, that is already happening here, but we hope to enhance further the interdisciplinary team training, both across students groups, postgraduates, as well as those in practice. I'm intrigued, and I hope others will help us explore this intersection of learning science and neuroscience. And I believe there's opportunities to inform the future direction of experiential learning in ways that we've not imagined before. And then finally, the future of healthcare delivery systems and facilities, I kind of believe, are unknown unknowns. And I think the theater is one approach that allow us to plan for an unknowable future. So thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to turn this one-way conversation into a two-way dialogue. So thank you. Yeah, Frank.
Thanks for the lecture. I always remember the first time I was in the Brain Institute and saw the mini simulator standing in a corner and had nothing to do with the simulator, but I think Sam was actually having the patient not do particularly well, and realized within about 5 minutes my palms were sweating. I wasn't even near the simulator. It did create a level of stress, which was incredible. But ask about we've really approached simulation on our own individual expertise based on the available technologies. Well, we haven't actually looked at it in an integrated fashion. You know, the work of Locke with avatars and getting the entire scenario from some soup to nuts all the way through. Could you address where you think that's going?
Well, I'll relate back to what Joe did with the medical student curriculum, because you're right, and I'm guilty of this too. There's a certain joy or excitement that comes with creating neat technology. So I think a lot of our early work was, we thought, oh, this appears to be important to anesthesiologists. Let's make a really cool simulator that helps learners learn how to use this technology. What was missing, and then I relate back to what Joe did with the medical education curriculum, they took 2 years to really say, okay, we're trying to get entry-level medical students ready to enter residency. What are all the elements that they need to learn along the way? And then where it makes, and after getting that curriculum designed, guess what the most important facility that we needed and we didn't have? And that's conference rooms that sit 16 or 20 people. So a big part of that building, there are no lecture halls in that building. We've got 15 very nice lecture halls surrounding us here. We didn't redo gross anatomy because those facilities are adequate. So we focused on what are the facilities that we need to implement the curriculum, and the curriculum was designed first around how do we get bright students become physicians ready to enter their residencies. In the same way, I think as educators, that's what we have to constantly force ourselves back to the curriculum. Who is the learner group, and from where to where are we trying to get them to? And then where experiential learning and simulator-based training makes sense, added on in response to the curriculum, not the other way around. So again, at one time it was, how can we make the total human being, the total mechanical human being, because then you could learn everything. Well, it turns out you don't need the total human being to learn everything. I'll just digress 1 minute to make the point, hopefully make the point even further. 15 years ago, we went over to Jacksonville, the F-16 pilots. There's a training center over there. And I'll never forget, as they stepped us through the various parts of their training program. And the first simulator that an F-16 pilot learned on was something that looked like a desk. It had a couple of controls. Didn't even look like the cockpit of a plane. But that exercise, or that piece of hardware, was designed to help the training pilot learn how to get the plane out of the hangar to the end of the runway. End of lesson. So just enough of the ground controls and the things you need to do to get a plane from the hangar to the end of the runway. And then there was another device. It kind of looked like a cockpit, but a lot of stuff was missing. But if you look closely, it had all the radar equipment. Well, they learned in this simulator how to navigate. This was when they were doing their navigation things, and only the panels that were related to the role of the navigator were real in this thing. And so they went through a series of these part task trainers, eventually culminating in what they called the domes. And there were these 2 huge, big circular domes. I don't remember, they were 100 feet tall or something like that, and the cockpit was elevated right in the middle of the dome. The 2 domes were separate, but the computers this pilot was flying from this dome or this simulator, and they basically were dogfighting. So the computer would take the image of wherever this person drove their plane and put it on the screen. It was the old Top Gun stuff, planes flying all over. So that was, to their equivalent of us, that was the full body, do everything patient. So there was a role for a very high fidelity, very sophisticated simulation F-16 trainer. But you didn't use that piece of hardware to learn how to get the plane out of the hangar and to the runway. And so I think what we always have to do is drive ourselves back to the educational curriculum. Who are the learner groups? what are we trying to get them, what are the knowledge or skills we're trying to get them, and then develop our simulation hardware, for lack of a better word, training devices, simulators around that. Is that helpful? You've developed a lot of devices yourself, but usually in response to a training need. I mean, something that we were having trouble teaching otherwise. So. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, first of all, congratulations. It must be very rewarding to see how after 30 years, how the field has matured to the level that you presented, and you guys started a long time ago. So this is really wonderful. You focus on the educational aspects, but I also think there's a role in research. I mean, for example, think about drug development today. More and more modeling and simulation is done, and less is trial and error in the laboratory. So could you foresee another building for research?
Sure. Well, all good points. We've there's a lot of mathematical models in the simulator. And we got into drug pharmacokinetics and so on at one point. And so I agree with you, it's not my area of expertise, but there are a lot of underlying mathematical models, and I do know, I know, the group, particularly down at Lake Nona, I think that's one of their areas of expertise, or how can you use particularly mathematical models that describe human physiology, pharmacology, drug distribution, and so on, to speed the process of drug development and even clinical trials. The math escapes me a little bit, but so I do think there's a role. I don't know if you need a building or a big computer, one of the two, but there are. I appreciate you making the point about research, and you're focused on the pharmacologic or drug development, but I also would challenge all of us to, there needs to be more educational research in the best way, kind of going back to what Frank said, what is the best way or the best sequence or the best curricula? I pulled the slides out, but in August, Academic Medicine has a paper. It's already posted on the before print version, and it talks about the top 50 cited papers in the medical education literature over the last 25 years. I was pleased that they lumped standardized patients and simulated patients together, but 7 to 9% of the top 50 cited papers are in either, 2 of them were on standardized patients and about 7 or 8 were on simulation. So it's a growing part of certainly medical education, and I would just challenge us. I think it's there needs to be more study and more scholarly pursuit of how to design not only the hardware, but perhaps more importantly the educational curriculum, the sequencing of events.
Question.
Yes?
Medi, Varigol, or mix?
Like many things, there's a variety of vendors and people that develop the training tools. And again, you just need to look at what the need is across those. I'm a little bit out of touch with the field now, but there's actually CAE and a long list of folks. So I was just over at the European Society of Simulation meeting, and I think there were 16 vendors present showing various training devices and simulators. So that's mainly finding the one that best meets what you're trying to teach a particular student group or learner group. Yeah?
So in addition to the discussion on research, there's also a potential application for piloting clinical trials or implementation science. For instance, there are some studies that need to be piloted before they actually go into the hospital and work on patients. They would be able to work through the logistics through simulations. So that's also a potential application.
A great comment, and I fully agree. And it's a very unsophisticated example of what you're talking about. But when they built the cancer hospital in 2009, in 2008 and 2007 and 8, they built full-scale replicas of the patient rooms and practiced things that you would, it's good to practice, like they would design the door and then can you really get a patient bed with a patient, around the corner. And they actually changed the design of the hospital room based on some of these implementation, in this case getting the bed in, but other things. If you notice in the cancer hospital, the whiteboards are not at the foot of the patient's bed, but they're next to the patient, because when you're, for example, coming out of anesthesia, you can't, your vision isn't great. So things like lights that only light the floor, so then in the middle of the night the nurse comes in and turns on the light, they don't have that blinding fluorescent light. So these are very simple and they're more architecture design kind of things, but your point is we should build models and we should practice the actual delivery of care as part of the design phase for a lot of things that we eventually end up doing in healthcare. That's a great point. All right, Wednesday, 4:30, and actually I appreciate your comments, but actually the hard part begins, because now we're going to have this great facility that we've got to fill up with rich educational experiences for our learners. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike.